continue the recording. So we had a discussion about this in like our staff retro about like how like instructional practices and this idea of like the banking model versus you know, this idea of like the student and the teacher are learning together, and like it's a kind of like a cohesive bond of like us kind of attacking these problems together. And I definitely want you all to feel like that is the case, and it's not just me like telling you this is what you need to know. It's like, no, like let's question a ton of stuff. Like, yes, there's a ton of Rails conventions that you just kind of have to know how they work, and yes, we have to show you how that works, but like think about the why behind any convention or the why behind any design principle such as today, like MVC. And like let's think about like them all as they're just ideas, right? Someone created and thought was a good process. And if your idea is good enough, like Rails, if it's good enough people start to use it, and now you have this community. Now you have this framework that people want to use and use to build web applications. But before, at some point, it was just like a collection of ideas that someone thought might be helpful. So let's like question the why and question, you know, what makes this good versus great versus I can't even imagine it another way. Cool. So let's share. Okay. So this is a lesson plan for today, and I'll just link it in the chat real quick, maybe quickly. Okay, got it. All right. So MVC is a design pattern. Stands for Model View Controller, and it's a way to, it's kind of like, you can think of it as a separation of concerns, right? It's like one of the first things we teach you, because it's like a paradigm of how Rails separates concerns when building web applications. Cool. And then the other vocab word is domain specific language. I know, like Brian said this morning, like vocab is going to be super important. Yes. And this one less important than the rest. So MVC, model view controller, super important. Domain specific language, kind of like a nice to know, but not a need to know. Okay, so let's have you all think to yourself and maybe take like a minute or two to jot some things down. But let's talk about, yeah, let's take like 3 minutes on this. Jot down in your notebook or in your Google Doc, whatever you use, what are the primary responsibilities of the models, the views, and the controllers in the task manager tutorial? All right, so thinking to task manager, if you don't have it up, like pull it up, see, and like let's describe what are the primary responsibilities of these 3 things. Okay, I'm gonna do this slightly different. So if you did the task manager tutorial as part of the pre-work, which hopefully you did, just raise your hand in the participants panel. Virtually raise your hand, sorry, I always do this. Okay, cool. So let's hear from Hash. Um, what were your, like, how did you describe the responsibilities of models, views, and controllers?
Yeah. So basically, the controllers I just described is kind of like um, what it's doing is like getting and setting information essentially. Is that it's just when you looked in the roots folder, there was all the get post patch stuff. So it's kind of what I assumed out of that controller setup. The models was let's see. The models was basically that was a little confusing to me because all we had was the one class, but which inherits from uh, application record, which inherits from active record. So I'm not really sure exactly what that's doing. I guess maybe just it's providing some back end stuff of methods because it's inheriting a bunch of methods. I don't really know what it's doing. And then the views for me was just what the user sees, displaying that data.
Totally. I think that's a solid description. I think you nailed it with the model. You looked at the inheritance and we're like, oh, there's probably like some methods coming in that I'm not aware of just yet. But yes, that is true. And you're getting those from application record, and then one parent, the grandparent in that case would be active record. So yes, great. Anyone have something they want to add to what Hash said about maybe controllers or views? Since your hands are all kind of like randomly up, I guess I could either call or you could just unmute.
It seems kind of straightforward. Like a model's a model, views used to view it, a controller is used to control it. I don't know. Just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the naming is pretty like not ambiguous, right? Like the naming is pretty straightforward. I would say like yes. However, like when building these web applications, I don't know if it's all going to be like super straightforward right up to the front. But as far as like separation of concerns, I think like you can think of the views as like, hey, this is what we are going to be like rendering back to the client and for the user to see. And this is going to be like, a combination in Rails of HTML and Ruby code. And then also with the controller, you have to think of the controller as like kind of like similar to the server, and where the controller is like figuring out what to do with any given request, right? Like any request that comes in, the controller is like, oh, I need to get this information from the model and get my data from over there, and I need to pass that information over to the view. So you can think of the model as the controller as having a hand in both the model and the view, and kind of passing information from one to the other. Cool. Yeah, let's break it down a little more. Did someone else have something they wanted to say?
Just associate CRUD with the controller. I mean, it's running through all that and doing what you need it to, or giving the framework to get, and post and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yep. Controller definitely associated with CRUD actions. Cool. And I'm not going to go into that too much more, but it's coming. Cool. So yeah, so if we just like think of these like high level, it's like controllers gotta coordinate the response to an HTTP request, right? Like we learned about what action verbs like can come in and what kinds of requests generally we see via the HTTP protocol. It's like get, post, patch, delete, and put, or maybe puts. I can't remember. But we need something in our program to handle the logic for saying like, oh, this goes here. This type of request, I do this. This type of request, I do this other thing. All right. So it's common that also like controllers are linked with some model, right? So in Task Manager, we just had one because we had tasks is our model, task is our model, and then all of the tasks that we can create are rows in our table, but it's common that the controller will be linked to a specific model. And models, they're going to be representative of our tables in our database in general. Like we might have some like plain old Ruby objects that are separate from our models, but like kind of look pretty similar. But basically, if we have a model, it's there to interact with our database and hold methods that are specifically to get information and manipulate data in a way that's related to a particular resource. So in this case, the task. Yeah, Kira, I saw your hand go up.
I was just putting it down from before.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, so, and then the views, it's the template for like what the user is eventually gonna see, right? Like it's like, hey, this is, now we need to organize our data in a way that the user can see, understand, and that follows, a specific markup language. We use HTML, and it's kind of like this idea of like, now we'll display the data in a way that makes sense to the user. Cool. Yeah, all right, so I'm gonna cold call. I kind of want this to be more interactive than just me looking at this stuff. So let's start with Daniel. Daniel, I'm gonna need you to share your screen, and I would love for you to show me your routes file, routes.rb of Task Manager.
Me or Halverson?
Dan is Dan. Dan is Dan H. You're the only Daniel I know.
All right, I'm sorry, I don't have my item pulled up. I was unprepared for that. You got me.
That's okay. Yeah, let's pull it up and open Task Manager, and yeah, we'll take a look at the routes file. And Daniel's not going to be the only one that I call on. So if you don't have Task Manager pulled up, make sure you have it ready to go.
For everybody else, don't let my sacrifice right here go to waste. Learn from me. You've got a lot of encouragement coming in from the chat. D for Daniel. D. Where is share screen? Here we go. Am I sharing right now? I've never
You are.
shared. Okay, great.
Yep, we got it. Cool. Yeah, let's go to the routes file. So do a Command P. And then start typing routes. There you go. Yeah, Fuzzy Finder is going to be basically the only way I expect y'all to get around these Rails applications. If I see you clicking in the folders, I'm just going to tell you, we don't have time for that. So Command P is going to be your friend for this mod. Okay.
This is awesome. I didn't know about that. So.
Yeah, it's a good one. Okay, so we look at our routes file. So the routes in Rails are defined as part of Rails's domain-specific language. All right, so specific to the way that Rails interacts, it understands how it understands like the keywords that are in this route. or in this routes file. So the first keyword that we have is a predefined method, and of these routes corresponds with the HTTP verb the request is making to the route. So we have a get in here, I see a post, I see a patch, and I see a delete. All right, and so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this first keyword. All right, and so this first keyword takes an argument, all right, and that is the string version of the path that the request is being made to. All right, so let's have Daniel let's have you highlight get, this first one. All right, so that is the first keyword, and that's the, this is like basically a get, right? In this case is a method for Rails, and then it takes an argument of the next thing in a string, which in this case happens to be just the /, which is the root of our application, right? So this is the welcome page, and then the next part of it, this second argument specifies which controller should handle the request, all right? So where are we routing this to, right? And so now we have, this looks like to me, like kind of like a key value pair. And you can tell that it's the second argument though, because you have the comma in between the first argument, which is the /, and then the comma. Now we have a second argument. I know that there aren't parentheses around, but that's actually like what's happening under the hood is like get is a method, and then it takes these arguments. And it's telling us which controller and which action we want to go to. So in this case, it's saying whenever I get a get request to the root of my application, I want you to route this through the welcome controller, and more specifically within the welcome controller, it needs to be routed to the index action. All right, and so I'm gonna send you like a little thing to put under here, Daniel, in the chat. So if you just comment this out and put it in there, that would be helpful. And it's basically just like this way that we can think of what the this syntax in the string needs to be. So it's basically welcome is the controller, #index is the action. Yeah, and do you mind just tabbing that over to be under welcome? Awesome. Yeah, so that's kind of how we can think about it. And that is for each, that's like for every single one of these routes, right? We have to have a place to route take care of this request. In this case, it's welcome index. In the next one, it's the task controller, and then it's the index action of the task controller, and so on and so forth. Cool. Any questions coming up about this, like kind of like controller routing?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I got you.
So many questions. So you said an argument, but there's no parentheses here. So would it work with parentheses?
I don't know, and that's not the first time you're gonna hear me say that, but like Rails convention tells us don't put parentheses around it in the routes file. But let's do it real quick, Daniel. If you want to put parentheses around like on line 3, open them before the string and then close them after the second string. Yep, so it would kind of look like that. Well, we don't want a string there, we just want parentheses.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? You just
Yep, totally.
So,
nope, you're good. So see where you have that double quote? Replace that with an open parens.
so just like that?
Nope, an open parentheses. So like a parenthesis, like how, yep, exactly. Yep, and then same thing with that. Yeah, there.
What's even English? I don't know.
You're good. I know it's day one. We're working back into it. So I don't know, but that's how you should think of like how this looks under the hood. Like that's how you should think. It's similar to like the assert, like how we do assert equal, assert, whatever in mini tests, and they don't take parentheses generally unless we have to pass them the hash that certain way. Similar to that here, where like this is what's happening. It's a get method. That is the keyword, and it's a method that like is already built into Rails for you. And like it's basically saying it needs 2 arguments. It needs the specific path that you know, when this path is part of the request, like this is where I go, and the other part is the controller and the controller action.
This is really helpful because I definitely thought that closing parentheses went right before the comma.
Ah, yeah. So this is helpful because it shows you like, hey, that first argument is a string, right? And then this next one, it's like using this keyword 2, and it kind of looks like a key value pair where 2 is always going to be the key, and then the value is always going to be the string of controller, which controller, and then what action in that controller.
And the naming conventions of like how this relates to our controller file. Am I saying this right? I'm so
No, you're good. Yeah, you got it.
So after the pound, that name needs to match what?
It needs to match the action in our controller. So what I'll do here is
action is like AKA method.
AKA method. Yeah, we call them actions when they are part of a controller. All right. So if we look at, let's just have you, this leads into what I was going to do next. So Daniel, go to Command P and start typing tasks controller.
Tim, just an FYI, the parentheses doesn't work.
See, doesn't work. Hate to see it. But it's like, I want you to like think of it that way. Like get is the method, and then it takes 2 arguments. So yeah, so then this, let's bring up that routes file like to the side there. Yeah, cool. So now if we're looking at our task owner, let's look at line 5 in the routes. So get to tasks goes to the tasks controller hashtag index. So the action of index, which you can also think of as an instance method of the tasks controller. All right, so once, if a request comes in and the part of the URL, the path of that, the specific URI of the URL is hashtag task, it's like, hey, and it's a get, I know exactly what I need to do here. I need to like send it to this controller action. And then that controller action is gonna have some specific link to the models. Here, you can see it says task.all, and then it also sets this instance variable at tasks, and it says, okay, I need to get this information from the model. I need to send at tasks to my view. And that's kind of like the controller's job, right? It's like I have access to both the model and the view, and I need to simply pass task.all as at tasks to the view. And so now the view has access to your at task instance variable, but that's sort of getting ahead of where we are. But I just wanted to show those 2 things together.
Hey, Tim,
yeah, go ahead.
So like the get, the patch, the delete, those are like the do this action, like do the following thing. Like, what do we call that? Get?
They're HTTP verbs.
Okay.
All right. And they're like part of the HTTP protocol. I think there's like 7 total verbs that you can use, and we use like generally like 5 of them are like very common. And it's like get, post, patch, delete, and I want to say put, but I could be screwing that up. I'm pretty sure it's put. Okay, so awesome. Let's see where we're at. Thank you, Daniel, for doing this. I think this is like more beneficial than just watching me do it super fast. Yep, we passed data to views, cool. Okay, so one final thing on controllers. So we can either render a view, which is the default of what a controller will just do if you don't tell it to do anything, which if we look at yeah, if we look at index is a good example of the default happening in the task controller. We didn't call render specifically, we didn't call redirect to, so what it does is it renders its specific view template that is tied to the index action. All right, so that's kind of happening under the hood. It's abstracted away from you, but you can think of like rendering the specific view as the default behavior in Rails of your controller. All right. And yeah, so if you look for the file in a folder named the same as the resource in the views folder, then you'll have it. So if we look at do a command P, Daniel, and start typing index.html.erb. Okay, so this is important. Now look at this, leave it like this. The one that is tied to the index action of tasks is the one that has the tasks prefix directory. Yeah, it's this first one coming up. It's not this other one, which is also index.html.erb, but that one's tied to the welcome. Okay, and so this is where naming your directory structure really matters, because this is where Rails is looking for things by default. Okay, so yeah, if you click on that one, Daniel, then the reason that this view has access to @tasks is because it's tied to the index action of the tasks controller here. All right, and so this is like kind of seeing it in action. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you go back to the control P and explain how those two were different again?
Yep. So yep, totally. So start typing index.html, Daniel. And that'll get us both of those. Okay. So the difference is we see app, then we see views. If we're looking at the path below, both files are named index.html.erb. They're both named the exact same. However, where they are located in your directory structure is different. One is located at app views tasks and then the file name. The other is located at app views welcome and then the file name. So that is the difference, and one is associated with the welcome controller while the other is associated with the tasks controller. And that is like, this is one of the things with like, this is just like a thing that Rails does, where you set up your directory like this and it looks for it here by default.
I guess if we could go back to the routes
Yep.
page, because for some reason I thought we did want the index, because it says tasks then index. So that's where I'm confused as far as like, oh no, it says welcome index. Never mind.
Yeah, so they're different, but they're kind of like, they're slightly, so we're looking at the tasks controller on the right. So can you highlight line 5, Daniel? And I kind of like, this is kind of on me, I kind of switched tracks just slightly, but when a GET request to the specific URL /task comes in, we route that to the tasks index action, which then also routes to its personal view that is kind of like set up specifically via the directory structure of like app, views, tasks, and then index.html.erb. All right, so these things are all kind of linked. And this is like part of this whole MVC design. Like we have our tasks views folder, we have our tasks controller, and then we have our task singular model. And these things are all connected, and this is kind of like how we fit the piece together.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would it be safe to assume that we would probably start then like in like the config or whatever, like in a routes, right? Like, so you're setting the routes and then you know that that's the next place that you're going to go to make whatever adjustment you need to for the rest of the MVC.
Yeah, so yeah, it would basically start with the route, right? And we're gonna get into TDD. Don't you worry, TDD is our best friend, and it's coming back tomorrow. And I'm telling you, I wouldn't have survived Mod 2 without TDD, because there are all of these pieces like that. You're like, wait, okay, like there's this model, there's this view, there's this controller, and we have to like define this route. Great thing about TDD, if you write the test correctly, it tells you what to do next. It's like, there's no route. Oh, okay, I'll go make the route. Oh, there's no controller action. Okay, I'll go make the controller and the action. Great. And it tells you kind of like one by one, step by step, like what to do via TDD, which is great. So don't worry, it's coming. This is more supposed to be high level with an example so that you can look at. Cool. Let's take a break. Let's take 5 and then jump back into it.
Thank you, 45.
Thanks, 45.
Thanks, 45.
Thanks, 45.
All right, it's 2:45. Let's come back together. All right, we've got some hands up from the last time, so I just want to make sure I get to everyone. I'm gonna, okay, yeah, okay, cool. Angela, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess I was just wanting to confirm if I understood what you were saying. So when a route starts with a GET request, the default action for Rails is to serve you the specific view for that action.
So it's not necessarily tied to the GET request because the GET request is tied to the action, and then the default behavior of any action is to render a view. Okay, so that's like slight, like, yes, you're saying, I think you're saying the right things. Is just like slight, like the GET basically gets processed over here in routes, and then now the controller's action is the one that is going to be like rendering a view by default.
I wasn't sure because for some reason I heard that, and then when I looked at our post, our patch, and our delete, all of those got redirected. So I wasn't sure if that was a coincidence or it actually meant that the GET ones are default and the other ones weren't.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there might be some times like with GET requests that you that you like have a non-default action, but in general, a GET is like, hey, get me this information and display it. There's nothing like necessarily dynamic. It's GETs are meant to like retrieve information and display based on what the request was. Whereas if we look at some of the other ones like patch, delete, post, like those are now, those are like doing some things based on some of the params that come in. And that's part of the reason why these redirects are asking, because it's like, hey, okay, like if we look at if we look at create, it's a good example, right? So this post comes in, and we don't even have we don't have anything dynamic coming in from the user from the web. We're just saying like, hey, when this comes in, or we don't have an ID that's dynamic, I should say. We do have some things that are dynamic coming in, and that is the tasks title and then the task description, and those we are getting from the user. But we need something to happen and to display to the user once we have created this new task. And so in this case, this is why we're using a redirect, because this is like where we want the user to go, like to a page that displays all tasks so that they can see, oh, hey, look, there's my new task that got created. And that's like a standard kind of behavior that we're gonna approach this like create action with. You'll see this like very commonly.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely. And like sometimes, yes, like it's a good thing to point out though, because like we have these options of like using this render keyword or using this redirect to keyword to tell like our controller action what to do after it does something. Or we have this other like option, which is the convention, where we don't say render by default, but it is happening under the hood. Right? It is like this render for show and this render for index is happening just as the default. Cool. I think I saw another hand, Leah.
Yeah, just clarifying. So even though routes doesn't live in our controller directory, it is considered part of the controller within the MVC model?
Not necessarily, no. So it's kind of considered outside of that. It's like it's our router. So a router is kind of like the first thing that our application is going to use to process a request, right? And then from that point, once the router has, figured out like, hey, this is this type of request, it's a post to the resource tasks, and we know that that goes to the create action, then the router is done. So it's basically that first kind of step of like this entry point into your application where you're kind of like telling it where to go. But the controller is kind of a separate entity in MVC.
Okay. And then I have a follow-up question.
That's cool, yeah.
Like the controller, my understanding was that it's kind of like a middle person between the view and the model, but like we're doing some databasey stuff like writing and deleting here. Like what are some examples of what would live in the model then?
Yeah, we'll get to some of that, but like more like complex data logic. So other like other methods that maybe perform that need to interact on like specifically the data. Like these are like, this is a find here, this is an all here. These are like pretty I want to say like not basic, but they're not that complex as far as how we're interacting with the database. Once we have to like do more complex queries with the database, that stuff will live on our model. But if it's just a find, if it's just a create, if it's kind of like any of these basic CRUD actions, then we'll probably do them in the controller. But if it's more complex data logic, then that will be kind of abstracted over to the model.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
And I don't know if you're meaning to or not, but we can't see your face.
Really? Oh, I just didn't turn it on.
It's kind of creepy. It's like coming from a black screen. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all I had.
Cool. I didn't mean to do that. I just forgot. Okay. I think I saw Philip. Did your question get answered?
Yeah, sorry, I had to find the unmute. I just wanted to make sure, like, I understood, like, how it knew what tasks is. So, like, over where it says, like, 2 tasks index or
Yep.
two tasks new, it's referring to the file pathing when it says tasks?
This is one, I mean, you can think of it as referring to which controller here. Like
Okay.
this, if we think of like what Daniel had, like this is the controller, and then the action. So these are the two, if we thought of this like in a dynamic way, it's like, hey, welcome is the controller, and then index is the action. And so that's how it will be all the way down. Like task is the controller, index is the action. Task is the controller, new is the action. But also the way that we like organize our directory structure will also be like in a way that is like similar. So if I look at controllers, it kind of like we already have this tasks controller here that lives under the controller's directory. So it knows to like, based on where you've put things, like where to go.
Tim, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So let me know if you felt this way. When I was learning Rails, it very much felt to me like it's so silly how everything has to be named correctly and the files have to be named correctly and all of this. I was like, really? That's the way it works? It really cares about how it's named? Okay, like I guess I'll just make sure everything is named okay. But it really just felt silly to me at first.
Yeah, I think that the longer you, I guess like my opinion is that the longer that you use in an the same application, like, and try to scale it, the more this complexity will like feel, I guess, dense for developers approaching it. So in that sense, I've thought like, oh, thank you for making the naming conventions like so specific and strict, because otherwise it would be harder for me to like figure out where things should live and why. But this was also the first framework that I learned. So I was like, oh, that's nice that they're doing this organization for me up front so that I can't screw it up really.
I found the naming conventions very helpful as well, just because it's like, it kind of keeps you on the same path as far as like where you're going. You just have to remember like in which order or whatever that you need to like do the next thing.
Yeah, and that is going to be so much more helpful once we TDD it. I promise. The TDD, if you love and embrace the TDD, Rails really makes it, makes it nice for you for step by step of what to implement. Cool. So let's move on. Brian, are you okay if I go till 3:10, or do we need? You're okay with that?
We're good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say about the controller. Is there anything else? No. All right, so let's look at the model. So let's get rid of all of these to avoid complexity. Okay, so this kind of goes back to what Hash was saying earlier. We look at this model and it's pretty light, right? Like it's inheriting from application record, but that's it. So there's nothing there, right? So like, how do we get all of these methods like .all, .find, which kind of goes back to Leah's point of like, look at all this stuff you're doing over here. Like, shouldn't that kind of go in the model? Totally valid question. But we, like, this is like another like convention thing. We'll generally do these like more base commands like find, like all in the controller, and we're getting these are active record class methods that are basically giving you access to the database without having to write SQL directly to the database, right? So we're getting some methods based on what we're inheriting from, in this case, application record, which if we look at application record as Hash pointed out, it inherits from active record base, all right? And so active record is where we're getting all of these kind of like class methods that we can call on our models. Yeah, oh, so something to note. So all of every controller, and if I look over here at my controllers, here in my controllers folder has access to every single model within the database. And you might think, oh, wow, that is like There's a lot of access. And I would say, yes, I agree. Like if I was designing Rails, I might try to limit it to be related to that specific controller. But as applications get more and more complex and resources become more and more linked, and we have some like nesting of resources, they went with the idea of like, let's just give the controller, you know, access to everything and hope that our developers practice good design patterns and only use, don't bloat our controllers, which I can tell you based on my last job is not always the case. Sometimes you get into a controller file and it is ugly. It is real ugly. So caveat there is practice the good conventions, because they over time they do start to add up and they will work against you if you're not using them. What else do I want to say? Okay, yeah, and if my model, if my model inherits from application record, there should be a corresponding table in the database. All right, I'm gonna say that one more time. If I have this model, which basically is just a task here, a task class that inherits from application record, then it needs to have a corresponding table in the database. All right, that's kind of like, this is what separates it as a model from like a plain old Ruby object like we were dealing with in mod 1. Cool. And then, yeah, we always name, similar to how we named our classes in mod 1, we name them singularly. Same thing with models, like always going to be in the singular. Okay. All right, now let's look at views. So I can look at my app here, and by default, like Rails is going to look for our views in a views directory. All right, and so that's why this folder kind of comes stock when you create a new Rails app. And it's going to kind of, this is another thing where this is kind of goes back to what Brian was talking about. I think it's weird like how it, like they make you name it a specific way, and this is where it kind of really matters, where you've got to have your path correct to match your controller action, because like if we look at tasks and we look at welcome, they both have this index.html.erb file in there, right? Like there's two of them. They're exactly the same, index.html.erb. The only difference for Rails being able to find them is this tasks directory or this welcome directory. Kind of like figuring out, hey, which view am I going to render? And it's looking in views, and then it's looking based on what the controller name is. All right. Yeah, there's some dynamic stuff going on. So it's HTML.erb. ERB stands for embedded Ruby. And it's kind of like helping us tell the view, like based on what we pass from the controller, I guess how to deal with these dynamic objects that we also want as part of the view, right? Like we want, we want all of the tasks in our database. So there's a lot of like layers of abstraction happening to this point. It's like, all right, there's a tasks table, and then within that task table, there are specific tasks, specific rows in the table. And then to grab all of them in my controller, I use this task.all, which is like a complete abstraction of like just transmitting that raw data from the database into task objects that I can now work with. All right, so now I've kind of like Rubified them or active recordified them so that I have like all these Ruby objects that are tasks. And then I need another way from my controller to pass all of those tasks to the view. And I can do that with my instance variable, pass it over here to the view. Now this here, we can see that since there's a dot each coming on it, looks like that's probably an array. And now for each task, I can render this view dynamically based on that specific task ID, that specific task title, and kind of like so on and so forth. Yeah, this is like our way of, if this, this is not that much code, but say we had 100 tasks in our database, then we would have this HTML code rendered 100 times dynamically for each task. And so that's kind of like the power of this ERB, is like we're abstracting some things away, but we're also keeping the code kind of clean here, where we can use an each to dynamically kind of like render our specific HTML the way that we want for each of our objects here. One thing to note is these little bracket tags here. You'll notice that like these are not the same. So if it has the, what do we call them? Lobster claws, whatever. If it has the equal sign, it's actually going to display the information that is being rendered here. Whereas if it doesn't have the equal sign, it's a way for us to embed the Ruby code without actually displaying it to the user. All right, so this is our way of basically kind of saying like, oh, I need to set up an each block, but I don't want at task.eachDo block variable task to show up to the user, right? I just want that to be running in the background. I don't want to show the user that. So if I needed like some conditional logic, right? Like some ifs, that's another thing that I would probably choose to not actually render as part of the page. I think that's all I wanted to say about the views. Any questions coming up? I haven't heard from y'all in a bit, so I'm feeling lonely over here with just me and my voice.
Go ahead. I'll raise my hand and go after you.
I don't really know if I have a question, just so much as like, I feel your love and your passion, Tim. None of these dots are connecting. I have no idea what the last 10 minutes were about, and I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. That's totally okay. I appreciate you like telling me that. So we'll bring it back to the lesson, which is MVC, right? It's a design pattern, okay? And I'm kind of going through each part of that design pattern. We have the model. Let's start with, we start with M in MVC. So we've got the model, and that is modeling a table in our database in a way that is Ruby friendly, in a way that like we get to use Ruby and convert into Ruby instead of like using actual SQL to like interact with the database. This kind of like abstracts that database interaction away. And so now we have like a Ruby model, which models our table in the database. And the database is basically used for us to like store, information. Then we have the view, which I was talking about before. And so the view is a specific HTML page that is associated with a specific controller action. And the view is actually what the user sees, right? It's the response in this request response cycle that is sent back to the browser. It is a way for the browser now to interpret what we want the user to see. And we do that via, in Rails, a combination of HTML and Ruby. And so this is literally like Ruby code and HTML code jumbled together in a way that probably looks intimidating right now, but in reality, it helps make our lives easier in creating dynamic views that we want to show to the user. Yeah, and that's our view in this kind of like tripod MVC. And our controller is the kind of the piece that has its hands a little bit dirty in both the view and the model, right? It has specific actions that call onto specific class methods or active record methods on the model. So index is a good example of one where it's like, hey, my index action is generally associated with all rows in my database. And so all of this task model, every single one that I have in my database, my index is generally used for displaying all of them. All right, and so this is like just one action in the controller. And then when I want to go to another action in the controller, such as show, that does a different thing. And generally, like what a show is going to do, and for our purposes all the time, is it's going to take in a specific ID, and it's going to get that specific resource based on the ID. And the ID is something that lives on each entry into the database, each task in the task table. So we're retrieving that by an ID, and we're showing that based on that specific ID. And if I look at the action, or if I look at the route here, I can see that my show responds to the URI path tasks and then a dynamic ID. All right, so this would be dynamic, could be 2, could be 3, could be 5005. And then it will say, okay, I need ID number 5005 from the task table, show me that resource. So totally get that this is like a ton of stuff coming at you, and like, remember it's day one, but this is the framework we're going to use to basically build all of the projects and all of the assessments that we're going to use. It's going to be model view controller, and we can think of it, it's a separation of concerns. It's a way for us to organize our app in a way that we can scale in a way that is organized. So it's like, all right, I need one of these for every table in my database, basically. It's like, in the task manager, we only have one resource, we have tasks, but if I needed to like keep building onto my application with more and more resources, now I use the MVC pattern for each resource. For tasks, it's like, oh, I got my model task, I got my table associated with that model, cool, I've got my task controller, great, and I've got my specific task views. And everything like that you see here is kind of like based on convention, and it's a pattern that we can depend on as Rails developers, kind of moving forward to all Rails projects to say like, this is probably how it should be set up, because this is the convention and the paradigm that Rails chose to use. Now, not to say that they're always going to be like that, but you can depend on the majority of Rails apps being set up in a similar way.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Of course. All right, Danny, go ahead.
So are we always creating tables? Is it always in a table format?
Generally, yeah, you're going to create the table in your database. And then from that point, once the table is created, then you will create a model, and that model will correspond with the table. And then you'll create a route, which then corresponds to a controller action, which then corresponds to a view. And I think that's how it works if we TDD it, but I'm not positive if that's exact, but I'm pretty sure it's like pretty close to that pattern. It's like, okay, like I'm creating, a table. I need a way to store users, right? So I got to create a user table in my database. And then what else do I have to do? Oh, I have to create a model to go along with my table. Oh, and I also need a controller so that I can access the model and send it to a view to display to the user about, this information about the users.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're creating individual tables, and then eventually, or at some point in those tables, then we're creating new tables. It would maybe grab information from one table or another table and combine it into a new table just based on the information that you're wanting to pull out.
Say that one more time, sorry.
Well, let's say like we have all these, like for the example, like when you're going through it, it's like you have your fruits, and then you assign each fruit like an ID, but then you want to see like, okay, now you have a person and a person's ID, and now you want to associate the fruit ID with the person's ID. So you're creating a whole new table that then pairs those IDs, so you can see like, oh, this person buys more apples than bananas.
So yeah, so most of what you said is like, yes, spot on. The way that we are going to like kind of like join those resources together is like where we get into like foreign and primary keys and how we like actually like associate tables. We're not going to talk about that to like right now. I think we'll talk about it tomorrow. But yes, you're on the right track there. Like everything you said. Yeah. I thought I saw more hands up, but I think a couple of you put them down. But I can answer them if you have questions. I'd rather you say them than not. Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
I just noticed how in both arguments, it seems like the route tasks is defined in both of the arguments. Like get tasks and then two tasks.
Yeah, so the difference,
One.
yeah, the difference is this one references the controller, and this one is actually in reference to the path, to that specific path of the URL when it comes in. So it's like, I'm not sure if I'm running the server. Maybe.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so if I go, no, not that one, this one. If I look here at localhost, like where I'm running this task manager, like this is basically, this is the root because I don't have anything here as my like URI. I don't have my resource here, but if I add something to it, right, like tasks, now I hit that and now it's like, okay, I hit enter. That means great. It's a GET request, goes to task index. And so now this controller was hit, this controller action was hit because I asked for this specific path.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Good question though.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure. Yeah, Adika, go ahead.
So this table, sorry, I went on a rant on it on the chat. That's why I'm like laughing. But because we didn't have any tasks created in our task manager yet, it was empty.
Yep.
We can, in fact, in our developing careers, encounter a table that already holds stuff.
Totally.
What does that one that holds stuff in it look like? I'm looking at your file and it looks really empty. And I'm just
so I feel like this would be easier to visualize. This will be easier to visualize in tomorrow's lesson, I promise. And I'm going to do it in the console. But basically, like we look at our schema, which is what defines our tables, like the table looks like, hey, it's got a title attribute, a description attribute, and it's a task table, and that's all it's got. And as if I like were to ask for all the tables with all of the task information in it, then I would get back objects, like Ruby objects like you're totally used to, of all the task objects with all the titles and descriptions and a unique ID for each one. That's like kind of like this under the hood thing that's happening. They're all going to get a unique ID too, so that we can identify them and get them specifically.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'm over on time. Sorry. For that, what did I want to say? Just like synthesizing like how this kind of works together. Like if we think about this HTTP request response cycle, it's like we get this verb, could be a get, post, etc. We have the path that's associated with it, could be the root, could be tasks with their ID. And then we say, okay, let's see what this verb path combo is and what controller action I need to reference based on the routes that I defined in my routes.rb file, which looks like this, right? So I get that verb, and then I get my path, and then that says, hey, you go here to this controller in this action, right? Within the controller, we do some data manipulation, like we say, like either we want all of the tasks or we want a specific task, and we're going to find it by the ID. Then we use our like instance variable as a great way for us to pass that information to the view, right? Like here's my model data manipulation, and then here's the way that I can pass that stuff to a view with my instance variable. I pass it to the view. Maybe in my view, I need to do some more work, like iterating over all the tasks to display them in a specific way. And then that is rendered to the user. That is the response that goes back to the client and what we see in the web browser. All right, I'm done.
And do you want to take a break? Can